The mall was alive with the spirit of Christmas. The laughter of children mingled with the sound of holiday music, and the air smelled like a mix of cinnamon pretzels and pine from the enormous decorated tree at the center of the food court. Lines of families snaked through the mall, each waiting for a chance to meet Santa Claus. Among them was Ava, a single mother, standing tall and graceful despite the weariness in her eyes. Her son, Liam, barely 8 years old, clung to her hand, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with his Christmas list written in his neat, careful handwriting. His eyes sparkled with anticipation, the kind of pure joy only a child could muster. "Do you think he'll really read it, Mom?" Liam asked, his voice high with excitement as he glanced at the list again. "Of course, sweetheart," Ava said, squeezing his hand gently. "Santa always listens to good boys like you." The line moved slowly, the festive buzz growing louder as they got closer. Liam kept craning his neck to catch a glimpse of Santa. Ava, smiling softly, let her thoughts wander. She worked double shifts as a nurse, barely scraping by, but moments like these made it worth it. Liam deserved a little magic, and she'd do anything to make sure he had it. Finally, it was their turn. The boy in front of them hopped off Santa's lap, clutching a candy cane. Liam's excitement bubbled over, and he tugged at Ava's hand. "Go ahead, baby," she said, laughing lightly. "I'll be right here." Liam dashed forward, his tiny sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Santa, an older man with a gruff demeanor, barely smiled as he gestured for Liam to sit on his lap. Liam climbed up, holding out his list eagerly. "What's this, Carl?" the mall Santa asked, taking the paper. His voice was gruff, a sharp contrast to the cheerful image he was supposed to portray. He scanned the list, his bushy white eyebrows raising. Looks like a lot for someone like you." Liam blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing," Carl said, too casually. His eyes flicked to Liam's jacket, a hand-me-down that was slightly too big, and his scuffed shoes. "Just wondering if your family can handle all this. Maybe stick to smaller wishes, huh?" Ava froze, her heart dropped, her smile fading instantly. She saw the slight slump in Liam's shoulders as he processed the words. Around them, a few parents glanced over, some with awkward sympathy, others with quiet disinterest. "But Santa," Liam said, his voice small but steady, "I don't want all the toys. I just want—" Yeah, kid," Carl interrupted, waving him off. "I hear this all the time. Everyone's got a sob story. Next." Ava's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to step forward, to pull her son away from the man who had just crushed his spirit, but she didn't, not yet. Instead, she clenched her fists at her sides, forcing herself to stay calm. Liam slid off Carl's lap, his head bowed. He shuffled back to Ava, his list now crumpled in his small hand. "I'm ready to go, Mom," he whispered, not meeting her eyes. Ava crouched to his level, her heart breaking at the sight of his trembling lip. "Hey, it's okay," she said softly, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Santa's just having a bad day. Your wishes are perfect, just like you." Her words didn't seem to reach him. He nodded numbly, slipping his hand back into hers. As they walked away, Ava glanced over her shoulder. Carl was already laughing with a coworker, shaking his head as if Liam had been some kind of joke. The sight ignited a quiet fire in her chest. They passed the food court, where Ava bought Liam his favorite pretzel, and sat him down at a small table. "Wait here, sweetheart," she said, her voice calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Mommy needs to talk to someone, okay?" Liam nodded, nibbling at the pretzel without his usual enthusiasm. Ava stood and walked briskly back toward Santa's corner. She wasn't about to let this slide. Carl was adjusting his fake beard when Ava approached. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. He turned, his expression already impatient. "Yes. You were out of line with my son," Ava said firmly. "Your job is to spread joy, not tear down a child who came here to believe in magic." Carl shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "Ma'am, I deal with hundreds of kids a day. Can't keep track of them all." Ava's eyes narrowed. "Maybe you should start, because if you can't treat children with basic kindness, you shouldn't be wearing that suit." He let out a low chuckle, clearly unbothered. "Listen, lady, I've been doing this for years. Nobody's ever had a problem before. Maybe you're just too sensitive." Ava opened her mouth to respond, but a mall employee stepped between them. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Ava said, her voice steady. "This man humiliated my son. I want to speak to someone in charge." The employee hesitated, glancing nervously at Carl. "I'll see what I can do." As she walked away, Carl leaned in slightly. "You know, you're not doing your kid any favors, making a scene like this." Ava's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She turned and walked back to Liam, her mind racing. She wouldn't let Carl's behavior slide, not for Liam, and not for any other child who came here looking for magic only to be met with cruelty. As she reached the table, Liam looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "Is everything okay, Mom?" She forced a smile, cupping his face gently. "It will be, sweetheart, I promise." But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Ava stared at the clock on the wall of the hospital break room, its second hand ticking steadily, mocking her exhaustion. Her shift had ended an hour ago, but she was still here, charting the vitals of a patient she wasn't even assigned to. Another nurse had needed help, and Ava had stepped in without hesitation, like always. The coffee in her mug had gone cold, and her feet ached from the relentless hours spent on them. But Ava didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change anything. She glanced at her phone, the wallpaper a picture of her son, Liam, beaming with a wide gap-toothed grin. It was the picture she had taken on his first day of second grade. Her heart squeezed. She was already late picking him up from her neighbor's house. "Still here, Ava?" came a voice from the doorway. Ava turned to see Diane, her supervisor, holding a clipboard and wearing her usual expression of practiced indifference. "Just wrapping up," Ava said, forcing a smile. Diane arched a brow. "You know you're not on the clock anymore. You can't keep giving out free labor. It sets a bad precedent." Ava wanted to laugh at the irony. She couldn't remember the last time she had a lunch break, much less a day where she wasn't overworked, but she simply nodded. "I'll be out in a minute." Diane lingered for a moment before shrugging and walking away. Ava sighed, grabbing her bag and rushing out the door. She made her way to the parking lot, the cold December air biting at her face. Her car, an old sedan that rattled when it idled, was parked under a flickering streetlight. She started it up, the engine groaning to life, and pulled out of the lot. When she arrived at Mrs. Johnson's house, Liam was sitting on the couch, his tiny frame almost swallowed by the oversized cushions. He looked up as Ava came in, his face lighting up like it always did when he saw her. "Mom," he said, jumping up and running to her. "Hey, baby," Ava said, kneeling to hug him tightly. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of the kid-friendly shampoo he insisted on using because it smelled like bubblegum. "You're late again," Mrs. Johnson said from the kitchen, her tone edged with disapproval. "I know," Ava said, standing up and glancing at the older woman. "I'm sorry. Things ran over at work." "They always do," Mrs. Johnson said, shaking her head. You can't keep running yourself ragged, Ava. That boy needs you. Ava nodded, biting back the defensive words that bubbled up in her throat. She knew Mrs. Johnson meant well, but the comment still stung. She thanked the woman, bundled Liam into his jacket, and headed out. The drive home was quiet. Liam sat in the backseat, humming a Christmas song under his breath. Eva glanced at him in the rearview mirror, her chest tightening at the sight of his innocence, his unshaken optimism. Did you have a good day, sweetie? She asked. Yeah, Liam said, his face lighting up. Mrs. Johnson let me help decorate her tree, and guess what? I finished my letter to Santa. Ava smiled. Oh yeah, what did you ask for? Liam hesitated, his fingers fiddling with the zipper of his jacket. It's a secret, he said finally. Ava chuckled. Fair enough. I guess I'll have to wait and see. When they got home, their small apartment was cold, the heater struggling against the winter chill. Ava turned it up and set about making dinner while Liam sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and pencil. She watched him out of the corner of her eye as he wrote, his brow furrowed in concentration. Mom, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Yeah, baby. Why do some people think they're better than others? The question caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, her hands stilling on the pot she was stirring. What do you mean? Like at school, Liam said, his voice quiet. Some kids say mean things to me. Like, because I'm different. Ava felt a pang of anger and sadness. She walked over and knelt beside him, brushing a hand over his curls. Listen to me, Liam, she said softly. You are not different. You are amazing, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. Liam nodded, but Ava could see the doubt in his eyes. It broke her heart. She kissed his forehead and stood up, her resolve hardening. She had faced this kind of ignorance her whole life. It wasn't right, and she wouldn't let it define her son. After dinner, Liam handed her his letter to Santa. She unfolded the paper and read it, her eyes misting as she reached the end. Dear Santa, please bring my mom some extra strength this year. She works so hard, and I just want her to be happy. She deserves it. Love. Liam. Ava pressed the letter to her chest, blinking back tears. She kissed Liam goodnight, tucking him into bed and sitting beside him until he drifted off. As she watched his chest rise and fall in sleep, she thought about all the times she had been underestimated, dismissed, or outright ignored. She thought about the nurses who had taken credit for her ideas, the patients who had refused her care, the landlords who had hesitated to rent to a single black mother. But then she thought about Liam's smile, his laugh, the way he saw the world with unshaken hope. She thought about the promise she had made to herself after her husband died, to give her son a life where he would never feel less than anyone else. That night, as Ava lay awake in the quiet darkness of their apartment, she made a decision. She would fight for her son, for herself, for every moment of dignity she and Liam deserved, and she wouldn't stop until the world saw them the way she did, worthy, strong, and unbreakable. Ava pushed through the double glass doors of the mall, the cold air from outside still clinging to her coat, the festive decorations overhead, bright lights, garlands, oversized ornaments, seemed to mock her. They promised a warmth and joy she couldn't feel right now. Her grip on Liam's hand was firm but not too tight. She could sense the quiet storm brewing inside him, even as his small steps tried to keep pace with hers. His silence was more painful than anything. Usually, he was humming a Christmas tune or talking about what he hoped Santa would bring. Today, he was quiet, too quiet. She spotted the information desk near the center of the mall and made a beeline for it. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was sharp, replaying Carl's sneering face, his dismissive words. The humiliation in Liam's eyes haunted her, and she wasn't about to let it go. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but edged with tension. A young woman behind the desk, her name tag reading Emily, looked up, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of Ava's determined expression. "I need to speak with a manager." Emily blinked. "Is something wrong, ma'am?" "Yes," Ava said firmly, "and I won't be leaving until I talk to someone in charge." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking to Liam, who stood quietly at Ava's side. "One moment," she said finally, picking up the phone. Ava couldn't hear the conversation, but the way Emily glanced nervously at her and then back at the office behind the desk only fueled her frustration. A few minutes later, a man in a navy blazer walked out, his steps brisk, his expression polished but wary. "I'm Tom, the assistant manager," he said, extending a hand that Ava didn't take. "How can I help you?" "It's about your Santa," Ava said, cutting straight to the point. "The way he spoke to my son was completely unacceptable. He mocked him, humiliated him, and dismissed him as if he were nothing. That man has no business working with children." Tom's polite expression froze, then shifted into something more measured. "I'm sorry to hear about your experience," he said carefully, "but Carl has been with us for years. He's one of our most seasoned Santas. I'm sure there was some kind of misunderstanding." Ava felt her jaw tighten. "There was no misunderstanding," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was standing right there. He insulted my son in front of everyone. Is that how you train your employees to treat children?" "Ma'am," Tom said, holding up a hand as if to placate her, "I understand you're upset, but Carl has a reputation for being a bit blunt. It's just his way, and most parents understand that." "Blunt?" Ava repeated, her voice sharp now. "Is that what you call belittling an 8-year-old? Blunt?" "Look," Tom said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more clipped. "I'll have a word with Carl, but I'm not sure what you expect me to do. It's a busy time of year, and frankly, our Santa setup is one of the mall's biggest attractions. Replacing him isn't exactly an option." Ava stared at him, disbelief washing over her. "So, you're just going to let this go? Let him continue treating kids like this because it's convenient for you?" Tom's expression hardened, the polite mask slipping. "Ma'am, I'm doing the best I can here, but with all due respect, maybe this is being blown out of proportion." Ava opened her mouth to respond, but a voice behind her cut in. "Excuse me," it said, low but firm. She turned to see an older man in a janitor's uniform, a mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. His name tag read, Frank. His gray hair was neatly combed, and his expression was calm but resolute. "I saw what happened," he said, looking directly at Tom. "The lady's not exaggerating. That Santa's been out of line for years, and nobody's done a thing about it." Tom's face flushed slightly, his confidence faltering. "Frank, this doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't," Frank said, his voice steady. "I've been working here long enough to see how Carl treats people. He picks on anyone who doesn't fit his idea of normal. Kids, parents, employees, you name it." Ava felt a surge of gratitude, but also a flicker of anger. If people had known this about Carl for so long, why hadn't anyone stopped him? Tom glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. Other shoppers had started to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the raised voices. "We'll handle this internally," he said stiffly, his gaze flicking back to Ava. "If you'd like, I can offer you a gift card as an apology for the inconvenience." Ava stared at him, her anger boiling over. "A gift card," she said, her voice incredulous. "You think a gift card makes up for what happened to my son? for the way he was made to feel. "Mom," Liam said softly, tugging at her hand. She looked down at him, his wide eyes filled with worry. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't over, but she couldn't let Liam see her lose control. "Come on, baby," she said, her voice soft but firm. She turned to Frank. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his. He gave her a small nod, his expression kind but tinged with regret. As Ava and Liam walked away, she noticed a young woman dressed as an elf near the Santa display, her pointed ears and jingling hat unable to hide the tension in her face. The woman caught Ava's eye and gave her a small, hesitant smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like an acknowledgement, a quiet agreement that something was wrong. The next day, Ava returned to the mall alone. She couldn't let this go. She wouldn't. As she approached the Santa setup, she saw Carl in his red suit, laughing boisterously with a group of kids. Her stomach turned. He looked so confident, so untouchable. But she noticed something else too, the elf from the day before, watching him with a frown. Ava approached her. "Excuse me," she said softly. The young woman turned, startled. "I saw you yesterday. I think you know what I'm talking about." The elf hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I don't like how he talks to people either," she said, her voice quiet but earnest. "But he's been here forever. Nobody stands up to him." "Well," Ava said, her voice steady, "someone's about to." But as Ava made her way to the management office, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She could already hear the excuses, the dismissals. Carl had been there for years. He was a staple of the mall. Her concerns were probably being written off as overreaction. Still, she had to try. She had to fight. And then, as she rounded the corner, she saw Carl himself talking to Tom, his face smug and his voice carrying just enough for her to hear. "Some people just can't handle a little honesty," he was saying. "You know how they get." Ava froze, her fists clenching at her sides. The battle lines were drawn. This wasn't just about Carl anymore. It was about everything he represented, every time someone like him had been allowed to mock, belittle, and dismiss without consequence. This time, she wouldn't back down. The wind howled outside as Ava sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, and a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside her. Liam was asleep in the next room, his soft snores the only comforting sound in the apartment. Ava's eyes burned from staring at the screen for too long, but she couldn't stop. Every search she ran, every piece of information she found, added fuel to the fire growing inside her. Carl wasn't just a problem. He was a pattern, a history of complaints, quiet cover-ups, and unaddressed behavior that made her stomach turn. The first articles she found were nothing more than whispers, vague mentions of inappropriate comments from a mall Santa, stories buried in local forums or passed over on social media. It wasn't until she stumbled across a parents' group page that she found the real stories. One parent described how Carl had openly mocked their child for stuttering. Another said he had made a cruel joke about their daughter's weight, leaving her in tears. There were even a few accounts from former mall employees who had worked under Carl, describing his temper and how he seemed to delight in making others feel small. Ava leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the posts. How had this man been allowed to keep his job? The answer was obvious. People had complained, but nothing had changed. Complaints were brushed under the rug, written off as misunderstandings or dismissed entirely. She opened a new tab and typed mall management contact into the search bar. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she needed to do something. She couldn't let Carl get away with this, not just for Liam, but for every child and parent who had been hurt by his callousness. Just as she was about to click on a contact link, there was a soft knock at the door. Ava glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. She hesitated, her heart pounding slightly, before getting up and peeking through the peephole. To her surprise, she saw Frank, the janitor from the mall, standing there, holding a folder in his hand. She opened the door cautiously. "Frank, what are you doing here?" "I figured you'd still be up," he said, offering her a small tired smile. "Can I come in? I have something you need to see." Ava stepped aside, her curiosity outweighing her confusion. Frank walked in, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. He placed the folder on the table and gestured for Ava to sit. "What's this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank sighed, pulling out a stack of papers. "I've been working at that mall for almost 20 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of things, but Carl, he's the worst of them. I've been keeping a file on him. Complaints, incidents, things I've seen myself. I thought maybe, someday, someone would have the guts to do something about it." Ava stared at the papers, her pulse quickening. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Frank gave a bitter laugh. "You think they'd listen to a janitor? I tried once, years ago. They told me to mind my business, said Carl was good for the brand." His voice hardened. "But I'm tired of staying quiet. And after what he did to your boy, I figured you might be the person who could finally make some noise." Ava swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She reached for the papers, flipping through them quickly. Each page told a story. Angry emails from parents, notes from employees, even a few pictures that showed Carl yelling at someone or looking smugly indifferent. "This is incredible," she said, her voice shaking. "But will it be enough?" "It's a start," Frank said, "and you're not alone. I think there's someone else who wants to help." As if on cue, there was another knock at the door. Ava opened it to find the young elf from the mall standing there, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hi," she said, her voice uncertain. "I'm Katie. I work with Carl, sort of. I heard what happened with your son, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." Ava stepped aside, motioning for Katie to come in. The three of them sat around the table, the folder spread out between them. Katie added her own stories to the pile, recounting how Carl had belittled her for being too young and dismissed her ideas for improving the Santa setup. "He thinks he's untouchable," Katie said, her hands clenched into fists. "But he's not if we work together." Ava looked at them both, her determination solidifying into resolve. "Then let's do it," she said. The next morning, Ava dropped Liam off at school and headed straight to the mall. Armed with Frank's folder and Katie's testimony, she marched into the management office, her heart pounding but her head held high. Tom, the assistant manager, looked up in surprise as she entered. "Ms. Brown," he said, his tone wary, "what can I do for you?" Ava placed the folder on his desk with a resounding thud. "You can start by looking at this," she said. Tom hesitated, glancing at the folder before opening it. As he flipped through the pages, his expression shifted from polite indifference to unease. "This is quite a lot," he said finally. "Yes, it is," Ava said, "and it's just the tip of the iceberg. Carl has been terrorizing children, employees, and parents for years, and you've let him get away with it." Tom's jaw tightened. "These are serious allegations, Ms. Brown, but you have to understand, Carl has been with us for a long time. He's part of the mall's identity." "Part of your identity," Ava shot back. "Your identity is a man who bullies children and mocks his coworkers. That's what you want to stand for." Tom opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door behind him opened, and a man in a suit walked in. Ava recognized him from the mall's website, Mr. Crawford, the mall's owner. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. Ava turned to face him, her anger tempered by the gravity of the moment. "What's going on is that your Santa has been getting away with unacceptable behavior for years, and no one has done anything about it. Until now." Mr. Crawford raised an eyebrow, looking at the folder Tom held. "Is this true?" Tom stammered, clearly caught off guard. I wasn't aware of the full extent." "Save it," Mr. Crawford said, holding up a hand. He turned to Ava. "I'd like to hear more." Ava took a deep breath and launched into her story, laying out everything she had discovered. By the time she finished, Mr. Crawford's expression was grave. "This is unacceptable," he said finally. "Rest assured, Ms. Brown, we will take action." Ava felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by caution. "I'll hold you to that," she said. As she left the office, she felt lighter, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Carl had spent years building his false sense of power, and it would take more than one meeting to bring him down. But for the first time, Ava felt like she wasn't fighting alone, and that made all the difference. Ava's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She was sitting at the kitchen table, a mess of notes and printed out complaints about Carl spread in front of her like a battlefield map. She reached for the phone and saw a text from Frank. "Meet me at the mall tonight. There's someone you need to meet." Her stomach tightened, a mix of hope and nerves. She typed back a quick reply and checked on Liam, who was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, cutting shapes out of construction paper. "What are you making, sweetheart?" she asked, leaning against the doorway. "Cards," Liam said, his little hands moving with careful precision. "For my friends. Some of them don't have a lot of Christmas stuff, so I thought I'd make them something nice." Ava's heart swelled. He was only 8, but his kindness always seemed so much bigger than his small frame. She walked over and kissed the top of his head. "You're amazing, you know that." Liam grinned up at her, his gap-toothed smile filling the room with light. "You always say that, Mom." "That's because it's true." She returned to the table and stared at the papers again, her mind racing. Tonight could be the break she needed, or it could be another dead end. Either way, she was ready. Later that evening, Ava arrived at the mall, pulling her coat tighter against the biting wind. Frank was waiting near the employee entrance, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something more urgent. "You came," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "You said you had someone I needed to meet," Ava replied, her tone steady. "Who is it?" Frank glanced around, as if making sure they weren't being watched, and motioned for her to follow. They walked through a side door and down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. At the end of the hall was a small office, the nameplate on the door reading Mr. Crawford. Frank knocked twice before opening the door. Inside, sitting behind a cluttered desk, was an older man with a thick white beard and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He looked up as they entered, his expression curious but warm. "This is her," Frank said, stepping aside. "Ava Brown." Mr. Crawford stood and extended a hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Brown. Frank's told me quite a bit about you." Ava shook his hand, her grip firm despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. "I hope it's all good," she said, forcing a small smile. "Depends on your definition of good," Mr. Crawford said with a chuckle. "He tells me you've got a bone to pick with one of my employees." Ava's smile faded, replaced by the steely resolve she carried for weeks. "I wouldn't call it a bone. It's more like an avalanche. Carl has been mistreating children and coworkers for years, and no one's done anything about it. I have proof, complaints, witnesses, everything. And yet, here we are." Mr. Crawford's expression grew serious. Franks told me about Carl's behavior, but I wasn't aware of the full extent. I usually spend my time organizing charity events, not running the day-to-day operations. That's what I hire people like Tom for. Well, Tom's been sweeping this under the rug, Ava said, her voice sharp. And Carl, he's been getting away with it because no one's willing to stand up to him. Mr. Crawford leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Let me see what you've got. Ava handed him a folder, the one she'd been carrying like a shield. He flipped through it, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. When he finished, he set the folder down and sighed heavily. This is bad, he said, worse than I thought. It's not just bad, Ava said, her voice steady but tinged with anger. It's a pattern, and every time you or your managers ignored it, you sent a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable, but it's not. Mr. Crawford nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers. You're right, he said. This needs to be addressed immediately, but I have to warn you, Carl isn't going to go quietly. He's been here for a long time, and he knows how to play the game. Let him play, Ava said, her jaw set. I'm not backing down. As she left the office, a strange mix of relief and determination filled her. She finally had someone in her corner, someone with the authority to make a change, but she knew Carl wouldn't take this lying down. The next day, as Ava walked into the mall with Liam, she felt the weight of eyes on her. People whispered as she passed, their voices low but unmistakable. She caught snippets of conversation, words like troublemaker and attention seeker. Her stomach churned, but she kept her head high, her grip on Liam's hand firm. At the Santa display, Carl was waiting. His fake smile didn't reach his eyes, which gleamed with something dark and smug. Well, if it isn't our resident crusader, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Ava's jaw tightened, but she refused to engage. She turned to Liam, crouching down to his level. Go play with your friends at the craft table, okay? She said softly. I'll be right here. Liam nodded and ran off, his excitement momentarily dispelling the tension in the air. As soon as he was out of earshot, Carl stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. You think you've got me cornered, don't you? But you have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Ava shot back. A bully who's finally run out of places to hide. Carl chuckled, the sound cold and hollow. You think Crawford's going to save you. He's as much a part of this place as I am, and when I'm done, you'll wish you kept your mouth shut. Is that a threat? Ava asked, her voice calm but sharp. It's a promise, Carl said, his smile fading into a sneer. Before Ava could respond, she felt a tug on her sleeve. She turned to see Liam, holding a stack of brightly colored cards. Mom, look, he said, his face glowing with pride. We made these for the kids in the hospital. They're going to love them, right? Ava's throat tightened, her anger momentarily replaced by a swell of pride and love. They're perfect, sweetheart, she said, her voice soft. Carl snorted, his disdain evident. Teaching your kid to waste time on nonsense. Figures. Ava stood, her eyes locking onto his. You don't get to talk about my son, she said, her voice low but full of steel. Carl opened his mouth to reply, but a voice behind them cut through the tension. Everything okay here? Mr. Crawford asked, his presence commanding. Carl froze, his bravado flickering for just a moment. Ava turned to Crawford, her expression steady. Not yet, she said, but it will be. The battle lines were drawn, and Ava was ready. The mall was electric with holiday energy, the hum of excitement thick in the air. Families bustled from store to store, their hands filled with brightly colored bags. Children darted around, faces painted with the joy of Christmas, their laughter rising above the festive music. At the center of it all, under the massive, glittering tree, the Santa display was the biggest attraction. Parents waited in long lines as their children eagerly clutched wish lists, their eyes wide with anticipation. But for Ava, standing at the edge of the crowd with Liam's small hand in hers, the scene was anything but magical. This was the moment she had been building toward, the culmination of weeks of frustration, anger, and determination. She had spent countless late nights gathering complaints from other parents, listening to stories from employees who had been belittled by Carl, and meeting with Mr. Crawford to ensure that today would be the day Carl faced the consequences of his actions. But none of that erased the sting of Liam's humiliation or the heaviness in Ava's chest when she thought about how close she had come to letting Carl get away with it. Liam tugged on her hand, breaking her thoughts. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Ava looked down at him and forced a smile. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Are you ready?" Liam nodded, his grip tightening around hers. "I'm ready." Across the atrium, Carl sat on his throne, his red suit stretched uncomfortably across his broad frame. The fake white beard hung slightly askew, and his smile looked more like a grimace, but none of the kids seemed to notice. They climbed onto his lap one after the other, their innocence shielding them from the man behind the costume. Ava's stomach churned. She thought about the other kids Carl had hurt, the dismissive comments and mocking laughter he had used to chip away at their joy. Today, it would stop. Frank appeared at her side, his expression calm but resolute. He carried a clipboard in one hand, filled with signatures from employees who had come forward to support her. Behind him, Katie, the young elf, stood fidgeting with her costume, her nervous energy palpable. Despite her nerves, there was a spark of determination in her eyes that matched Ava's own. "Oh." "Everything's set," Frank said, his voice low. "Mr. Crawford's waiting in the wings. He said he'll step in when the time is right." Ava nodded, her throat tight. She looked around at the gathering crowd, parents and children oblivious to the storm brewing just under the surface. She stepped forward, her pulse pounding in her ears, and raised her voice. "Excuse me, everyone," she called, her voice cutting through the chatter like a bell. "I need your attention." The crowd quieted, curious faces turning toward her. Carl glanced up from his throne, his expression shifting from confusion to annoyance. He leaned back in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he watched Ava approach. "My name is Ava Brown," she continued, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "and I need to tell you all something about the man sitting on that throne." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, parents exchanging puzzled looks. Carl's jaw tightened, his hand gripping the armrest of his chair. "What's this about?" he barked, his voice sharp. "We're in the middle of something here." "And so am I," Ava shot back, her gaze locking onto his. "For too long, you've been allowed to treat people with disrespect and cruelty. You've humiliated children, belittled employees, and used your position to hurt others. And today, that ends." The murmurs grew louder, confusion turning to curiosity and unease. Carl stood, his towering frame meant to intimidate, but Ava didn't flinch. "You've got some nerve," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Coming here, making accusations in front of all these people. Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" "I do," Ava said, her voice unwavering. "I'm messing with a man who thinks he's untouchable, but you're not, and I have the proof to back it up." She turned to Frank, who stepped forward and held up the clipboard. "This is a collection of statements from parents, employees, and witnesses," Ava continued, "each one detailing the harm you've caused. And if that's not enough, we have something else." The crowd parted slightly as Mr. Crawford stepped forward, his presence commanding. He was dressed in an impeccable red suit, his white beard perfectly combed. He looked every inch the Santa Claus Carl pretended to be. A hush fell over the atrium as he approached, the weight of his authority palpable. "Carl," Mr. Crawford said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk." Carl's face turned a deep shade of red, his bravado faltering. "Mr. Crawford, I can explain." "There's nothing to explain," Mr. Crawford interrupted, his tone sharp. "I've seen the evidence. I've spoken to the people you've hurt, and I'm giving you one chance to apologize, to them, to this community, and especially to Mrs. Brown and her son." The crowd erupted into whispers, the weight of the confrontation dawning on them. Carl shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around, as if searching for an escape. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "I've been here for years. I've done nothing wrong." "Then why are there so many stories that say otherwise?" Ava asked, her voice cutting through the noise. "Why are there children who've left here in tears because of you? Why are there employees who've quit because they couldn't stand working under you?" Carl's silence was deafening. "Apologize," Mr. Crawford repeated, his voice steely. "Now." Carl looked out at the crowd, his eyes landing on Ava and Liam. For a moment, his expression softened, but it was fleeting. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff and insincere. "I'm sorry if anyone felt offended." "Not good enough," Ava said, her anger bubbling over. "Say it like you mean it. Or better yet, step down and let someone who actually cares about this job take your place." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, the energy shifting entirely. Parents clapped, children looked on in awe, and employees exchanged relieved smiles. Carl looked around, realizing he had lost. His shoulders slumped, and he muttered something under his breath before storming off, the bells on his suit jingling mockingly with each step. As the noise died down, Mr. Crawford turned to Ava and Liam, his expression softening. "Mrs. Brown," he said, his voice warm, "I can't thank you enough for bringing this to my attention. You've made this place better for everyone." Ava smiled, tears pricking her eyes as she looked down at Liam. He was beaming, his small hand slipping into hers. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with wonder, "you did it." "No, sweetheart," Ava said, crouching down to his level. "We did it." The crowd cheered again as Mr. Crawford motioned for Katie to step forward and take Carl's place. The young elf looked nervous but thrilled, her wide smile lighting up the room as she welcomed the next child onto her lap. Ava stood tall, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Liam run off to join his friends at the craft table. Today wasn't just a victory, it was a promise, to Liam, to herself, and to every person who had ever been made to feel small. They were stronger together, and this was only the beginning. The mall was quieter now, the holiday rush winding down after Carl's dramatic exit, but for Ava, the atmosphere buzzed with a different kind of energy, a sense of triumph that filled the air like the warm glow of the Christmas lights strung overhead. She stood near the Santa display, her hand resting on Liam's shoulder as they watched Katie take her place on the throne. The young elf looked a little nervous at first, but the moment the next child climbed onto her lap, her smile blossomed into something pure and genuine. Ava felt her heart swell. It wasn't just about Carl leaving, it was about what his departure represented, a crack in the wall that had allowed people like him to thrive unchecked, a turning point for every child who deserved kindness, every employee who deserved respect, and every parent who had been dismissed when they dared to speak up. Mr. Crawford approached, his red suit still immaculate, and stopped in front of Eva and Liam. His expression was one of quiet gratitude. "Mrs. Brown," he said, his voice steady but warm, "I owe you an apology. not just for what happened to your son, but for allowing this to go on as long as it did. You brought light to something that never should have been hidden, and for that, I thank you." Ava nodded, her voice calm but firm. "It's not just about us, Mr. Crawford. It's about making sure this place is safe and welcoming for everyone. No more excuses, no more looking the other way." Mr. Crawford's eyes softened, and he extended his hand. "That's exactly why I'd like you to join our advisory board. We need people like you, people who aren't afraid to stand up for what's right and hold us accountable." Ava blinked, momentarily stunned. "Me, on the board?" "Why not?" he said with a small smile. "You've already shown more leadership than most people I've worked with. You see what needs to change, and you're willing to fight for it. That's the kind of voice we need." Liam looked up at her, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, that's so cool," he said, bouncing on his toes. "You're like a superhero now." Ava laughed, ruffling his curls. "I don't know about that, kiddo," she said, her cheeks flushing. But when she turned back to Mr. Crawford, her expression grew serious. "If I say yes, I want to make one thing clear. I won't be a token name on a roster. If I'm doing this, it's because I believe real change can happen." "Then we're in agreement," Mr. Crawford said, shaking her hand. "Welcome to the team." As he walked away, Ava felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't just about the position, it was about knowing she had taken a stand, not just for Liam, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small or powerless. Later that evening, as they walked home, Liam clutched his mom's hand tightly, his steps light with joy. "Mom," he said after a moment of silence, "do you think Carl will ever be nice?" Ava thought for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, "but I do know this. When people like Carl face the consequences of their actions, it forces them to think about who they are, and maybe, just maybe, that's the first step toward change." Liam nodded, his face thoughtful. "I hope he learns to be kind someday." Ava squeezed his hand. "Me too, baby, me too." The next day, the mall buzzed with a different kind of energy. News of Carl's firing had spread quickly, and employees who had once walked on eggshells around him now seemed lighter, freer. Frank greeted Ava with a wide grin as she passed by the janitor's closet. "You did good, Ava," he said, tipping his cap. "Real good." "It wasn't just me," she replied, smiling back. "It was all of us." Katie ran over, still in her elf costume, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Ava, you won't believe this," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "So many people have come up to me today, thanking me for stepping up. I never thought, I was so scared before, but now," she trailed off, her eyes shining. "Thank you, for everything." Ava hugged her, feeling a swell of pride. "You stepped up when it mattered," she said. "That's what counts." As the days went on, more employees came forward with their own stories about bosses who had ignored them, coworkers who had mistreated them, and policies that needed to change. Eva listened to each one, taking notes and promising to bring their concerns to the board. Liam, meanwhile, continued his mission of spreading kindness. At school, he organized a card-making event for kids who couldn't afford gifts, rallying his classmates with the same quiet determination that mirrored his mom's. One afternoon, as Ava picked him up from school, his teacher pulled her aside. "Mrs. Brown," she said, her voice warm, "I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of Liam. He's been such a positive influence on the other kids. He's even started a kindness club." Ava laughed, her chest swelling with pride. "That sounds like Liam," she said. When they got home that evening, Liam handed her a card he had made. On the front was a drawing of Ava wearing a superhero cape, standing tall with a smile on her face. Inside, he had written, "Dear Mom, you are my hero. Thank you for teaching me to be brave and kind. I love you. Love, Liam." Ava felt tears sting her eyes as she hugged him tightly. "I love you too, Liam," she whispered. That Christmas, as they sat by the tree, Ava realized something profound. It wasn't just about what they had fought against, it was about what they had built together, a community of kindness, resilience, and hope. And in that moment, surrounded by love and light, she knew they had truly won. The mall was glowing under the soft, golden lights of the season. Snowflake decorations spun gently from the ceiling, casting twinkling reflections on the polished floor. A warm hum filled the air, laughter, holiday songs, the gentle hum of contentment. But this year, the atmosphere felt different, alive with a renewed spirit. It wasn't just the holiday cheer, it was the feeling of change, tangible and undeniable. Ava stood near the entrance, holding Liam's hand as they looked out over the bustling scene. Everything looked familiar, yet nothing felt the same. "Mom," Liam said, his voice breaking the quiet moment, "there's the new Santa." His small hand pointed excitedly toward the center of the mall, where a line of children was eagerly waiting to meet the new man in the red suit. The replacement Santa was everything Carl had never been. His laugh was genuine, booming across the atrium like a comforting blanket of joy. His energy was magnetic, drawing smiles from children and parents alike. He listened intently to every child who climbed onto his lap, his kind eyes sparkling behind gold-rimmed glasses. Even the employees seemed to walk taller, their shoulders lighter, as if the dark cloud that Carl had cast had finally lifted. "Do you want to go meet him?" Ava asked, crouching down to Liam's level. She brushed a hand over his curls, smiling at the excitement in his eyes. "Can we?" he asked, his voice hopeful but hesitant. "I mean, what if he's—" "He's not," Ava said firmly, cutting off the thought before it could take root. "This one's different. You'll see." Liam nodded, his trust in her unwavering. They joined the line, the chatter and giggles of other children filling the space around them. As they moved closer, Ava caught sight of Frank and Katie standing off to the side, both of them watching the scene with quiet pride. Frank gave her a nod, tipping his cap in that familiar way, and Katie waved enthusiastically, her elf hat jingling as she did. Ava felt a swell of gratitude. None of this would have been possible without them. When it was finally Liam's turn, Ava felt a knot of nervousness twist in her stomach. She watched as he walked up to the new Santa, clutching a small card he had made just that morning. The man greeted him warmly, leaning in to listen as Liam spoke in hushed tones. Ava couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw the way Santa's face lit up, his eyes crinkling with joy. He took the card from Liam and held it close to his heart, nodding solemnly before pulling him into a gentle hug. The sight made Ava's throat tighten. As Liam ran back to her, his face glowing with happiness, she crouched down to meet him. "How was it?" she asked, her voice soft. "He's amazing," Liam said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He said my card made his whole day, and he promised to help make the world kinder, just like I asked." Ava blinked back tears, pulling him into a tight hug. "You did that," she whispered. "You made a difference." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The mall management, under Mr. Crawford's guidance, unveiled a series of new policies aimed at fostering inclusivity and respect. Signs were posted throughout the mall, declaring it a place of kindness, and employees underwent training to ensure the values of empathy and fairness were upheld. It wasn't just about fixing what Carl had broken, it was about building something better. Ava found herself at the heart of it all, her new role on the advisory board giving her a platform to enact meaningful change. She worked closely with Frank and Katie, their voices just as vital as her own. Together, they created programs to celebrate the diverse community the mall served, cultural events, charity drives, and initiatives to support underprivileged families. Every decision they made felt like a step toward a brighter, more inclusive future. But the biggest moment came on Christmas Eve, during the mall's annual holiday parade. This year, the event was reimagined as a celebration of resilience and justice, with Ava and Liam chosen as the honorary guests. They rode at the front of the parade on a beautifully decorated float, waving to the cheering crowd as snow machines dusted the air with soft white flakes. "Mom," Liam said, leaning close to her as the float moved through the atrium, "do you think everyone's really happier now?" Ava looked out at the sea of smiling faces, parents lifting their children onto their shoulders, employees laughing and clapping as the float passed by. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, the anger, the struggle, the moments of doubt, and felt a deep sense of peace. "I think we've given them a reason to be," she said, her voice steady, "and that's all we can ever do, give people a reason to hope, and a reason to believe things can get better." As the parade wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Ava and Liam returned home, their hearts full. The apartment was quiet, the soft glow of their small Christmas tree casting gentle shadows on the walls. Liam settled at the kitchen table, a pencil in hand as he worked on a new letter to Santa. Ava watched him from the doorway, a smile playing on her lips. "Done," Liam said, holding up the letter triumphantly. "Do you want to read it, Mom?" "Of course," Ava said, sitting beside him as he slid the paper across the table. The words were written in his careful, childlike scrawl, but the message was clear. "Dear Santa, thank you for helping my mom and me make the world a little better. This year, my only wish is for everyone to remember to be kind, even when it's hard. Love, Liam." Ava felt her chest tighten as she read the words, tears pricking her eyes. She reached over and pulled Liam into a hug, holding him close. "You're incredible, you know that," she whispered. Liam grinned. "I learned from the best." The scene lingered, the two of them wrapped in the quiet warmth of the moment. Outside, the world was far from perfect, but in their little corner, there was love, hope, and the promise of something better, and that was enough.